Hello, I'm Maggie Snowling, and it's a great pleasure today to be talking to you about language in relation to literacy. In fact, what I'm going to be saying is language is everything for literacy. So I'm going to begin with the now familiar simple view of reading. According to the simple view of reading, reading comprehension is the product of decoding and language comprehension. Essentially, without being able to decode, you wouldn't be able to understand what you read. Without language, you could decode, but you would not have any understanding either. This framework has dominated research on children's language reading development for many years, and it's also influenced educational policy around the world. In the United Kingdom, it's the backdrop to the reading curriculum. Now, underpinning these two critical factors, decoding and language comprehension, are some other sub-skills. So underpinning decoding is letter knowledge, phonological awareness, the ability to reflect on the speech sounds of words, and phonics skills. While underpinning language comprehension is a whole range of spoken or oral language skills, such as vocabulary and grammar, and also we use background knowledge. Now, there have been more than 40 years of research on the causes of dyslexia, and we're going to be focusing on dyslexia in this talk. And generally, it is accepted that the difficulties in learning to decode, which are the cardinal feature of dyslexia, can be accounted for by problems in acquiring letter knowledge, phonological awareness, and phonological skills, all aspects of phonological processing, whereas in dyslexia, oral language skills beyond phonology, such as vocabulary and grammar, are intact. But I'm going to tell you a slightly different story, and the story I'm going to tell you today builds on a wider literature, the recent literature on the science of reading, and also research on effective interventions for developing language and literacy, but particularly for developing literacy. To preview this, let me show you a model which has come out of our research. Now, according to this model, learning to read depends on language. Traditionally, that's not the traditional view. The traditional view is that learning to read depends upon a triple foundation, which is shown here in the center of the model. Depends on phoneme awareness, letter sound knowledge, which I've already said, and also a task called rapid naming, the rapid ability to retrieve the names of symbols or letters or objects. Together, phoneme awareness and letter sound knowledge form what we call the alphabetic principle, and that's a key driver of learning to read, that is, learning to decode. Language, however, comes in as something underpinning reading comprehension. But according to this model that we've developed from our research, language is the foundation not only of the skills that contribute to reading comprehension, but also a foundation for that triple foundation of learning to read. The data that fueled the development of that model comes from a study, a longitudinal study we conducted called the Welcome Reading and Language Study, in which we recruited 3 groups of children. First of all, children at family risk of dyslexia, that is, children who have a first-degree affected relative, usually a parent, and we know that those children are at high risk of developing dyslexia themselves. It's a highly heritable condition. We also recruited a group of children who in the preschool years had language difficulties. They were recruited from speech language therapy and had a preliminary label of developmental language disorder, or DLD. And then there was a third group of children, it was a kind of comparison group, children at low risk of reading difficulties because they had neither a family history nor any preschool language difficulties. And we followed these children from the age of 3.5 through to the age of 8. We actually followed them up a further time at the age of 9. And during that period, we assessed them approximately annually. I'm going to today just focus in on the phase 1 risk factors that we identified, and then I'm going to focus on the period of school entry, which is between phase 2 and phase 3 in our model, because in England children go to school in the term that they are rising 5, and then and we're going to look at the outcomes for this group at the age of 8. And the outcomes we are going to describe as children with dyslexia or children with developmental language disorder, sometimes children with both conditions, and also obviously children with typical reading outcomes. Let's have a look now at the more detailed model that underpinned the framework that I showed you earlier. And there's a lot of detail here, but essentially what I want to just point out is that at 3.5, at the beginning of our study, we had 7 different measures of language processing, some that relied on more phonological aspects of language processing, sort of speech-like aspects, for example, non-word repetition or articulation measures, but also broader language measures like sentence repetition, vocabulary, and grammar. What we found was all of those different measures loaded on one construct, which we call language. And language then, moving across the this path diagram, predicted the triple foundation of learning to read, that is phoneme awareness, letter sound knowledge, and rapid naming, as shown here. And then between that point, the triple foundation, which was measured at 4.5 and 5.5 at school entry, letter sound knowledge, phoneme awareness together predicted decoding. So what this model shows is that early language, before a child goes to school, predicts the alphabetic foundation, and then the alphabetic foundation goes on as a strong predictor of children's decoding abilities. Later, we can measure reading comprehension. What you see here is that reading comprehension depends upon the child's decoding at 5.5 and their earlier language skills. So language has a long-range effect on reading comprehension. Its effect on decoding are fully mediated through letter sound knowledge and phoneme awareness. And if you are eagle-eyed here, what you will see is this is actually the simple view of reading. What we have here is that reading comprehension is depending upon the product of decoding and language, but notice very early language. So let's think about language then as a risk factor for difficulties in learning to read, that is for dyslexia. And here we show data from the children in our cohort study, in our longitudinal study, divided into 3 groups: typically developing children on the left, family risk of dyslexia in the middle, and children with preschool DLD on the right. And the diamonds are the individual children. On the x-axis at the bottom of the slide is performance on our phonologically based measures like non-word repetition. And on the y-axis up the side are our oral language measures like vocabulary and grammar. The crossbars indicate performance 1 standard deviation below average for age. So this is an important point, because what we want to look at is children who are performing below average for their age in either phonological skills or language skills. If you look at the typical group, most of those children are in the upper right quadrant. What that means is that they have good phonology and they have good language, and rather few of those children fall outside of the dotted lines. You could argue they are nonetheless at risk of reading problems. Now, if you look at the children at family risk of dyslexia, you can see a different pattern, because here, above the horizontal line, but to the left of the vertical line, are quite a few children who've got poor phonology in the face of quite good language. So if phonology is very important for learning to read, for learning to decode, then these children are at high risk of dyslexia, which is sort of what we know from the fact that they're at family risk. Now, if you move to the graph on the right of the slide, we have children with developmental language disorders in the preschool years. And what you see here is that many of these children are in the lower left quadrant. What that means is that they have poor phonology because they're to the left of the vertical line. They also have poor language, which is how they are defined. So let's now fast forward. This is when these children are in preschool, age 3.5 to 4.5. Let's now look at their outcomes when they're 8 years of age. And among the typically developing group, 7% had reading difficulties, that is decoding problems, at the age of 8, as defined by a composite of reading and spelling skills. That's about what you'd expect given population estimates. In contrast, children at family risk of dyslexia, 26% of them had dyslexia. That's about 4 times the risk compared to typically developing children, associated here with phonological problems. And if you look, though, at the children with early language difficulties, 66% of them would fill diagnostic criteria for dyslexia. That is, they had poor reading skills for their age, very poor reading skills, in fact. So returning to the framework that I showed you at the beginning, what we now think, contrary to what we thought 40 years ago, is that there are 2 risks for dyslexia. First of all, the conventionally understood risk, which is a difficulty in acquiring phoneme awareness, letter sound knowledge, and other phonological skills. But there's a second risk, which is children who have poor language when they come to school. And we have data in our study to highlight the fact that the critical point is around about age 4.5, when there is a small window at which you could potentially intervene to provide a stronger foundation for the triple foundation for learning to read. And just a word about reading comprehension, because we did also measure reading comprehension in this study. We measured it at age 9, which is a year after the diagnosis of dyslexia, if you like. And shown here on this graph are the difficulties, if you like, the gap between the reading comprehension of the children in the 3 outcome groups and their typically developing peers. The higher the bar, the bigger the deficit. And when you look at reading comprehension, we see an interesting stepwise pattern. So children who at age 8 are defined as having dyslexia have some reading comprehension problems, but they're not very significant. In fact, they're not statistically significant relative to the controls. Arguably, these difficulties are a product, a consequence of their decoding problem. Then you can look at children who at the end of our study didn't seem to have decoding problems, but had language difficulties, the DLD group. You can see they have very significant problems with reading comprehension. And then the final and the largest column are children who at the end of our study could be defined as having both dyslexia and a language disorder, and they have very, very significant reading comprehension problems, more than 2 standard deviations, that's 30 standard score points below the typically developing group. So what I want to argue from these findings is that language is the foundation of literacy, and it's not such a simple view as the view we always thought. So the view we always thought was that it was decoding and language that led to reading comprehension. We still believe that, but essentially we also see language as a foundation for the sub-skills that dictate learning to decode. These are not separable skills. They're not strongly dissociable. For many children, poor language leads to poor letter knowledge and poor phoneme awareness, and that in turn affects both their decoding and their reading comprehension. Actually, it's not such a new view. Going right back to the 1920s, Samuel Orton, an American pediatrician, neurologist, neuropediatrician, I guess, argued that dyslexia was a disorder of the language faculty. And much more recently, Valentino in 1979 reviewed a huge literature by that time looking for perceptual deficits in dyslexia and argued that these were in fact verbal deficits. So from where we are today, seeing that language is the foundation of learning to read, that there is a small window in which we can intervene to support children's language development, to prepare them for learning to read, we are very pleased that there are skills available to help language screening in mainstream schools. And also we know that interventions like the Nuffield Early Language Intervention is very effective as an intervention for improving oral language skills at the foundations of reading. So just to conclude, Early language is the foundation for learning to read. Language is a strong predictor of phoneme awareness. That's a sort of newish finding. The effect of language on reading and spelling in the first year of school is mediated by phoneme awareness and letter sound knowledge. So school entry is a critical phase for literacy development. And we know from a large body of clinical literature that children with weak language or developmental language disorder, if they come to school still with these difficulties not resolved, they're at high risk of poor reading. So to summarize again, there is a tight window of time in which to prepare children's language for learning to read and spell. We should intervene and not wait for poor reading to emerge. Thank you.